Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of An Evening with the Philosophical Muser. I was joined last year by digital technology expert James Moar, and we discussed online technology, social media, algorithms, browsing experiences, online shopping, marketing, the ethics and behavior of big tech companies, that sort of thing. And it was a really informative and thought-provoking discussion, which I'll put in the link below for anyone that wants to watch that, who hasn't seen that one. But one of the things I wanted to talk about in that show was AI, but we never got around to it then because it was such an interesting discussion about all the other stuff. So we said we do a part two, and
Yep.
this is it, and to get into a broader discussion. So here we are, and welcome back, James.
Thank you very much, James. It is good to be back. One thing before we do kick off, I just wanted to make a slight correction on some of the things I said in the last time I was here. I was saying that Amazon was being hauled over the coals for anti-competitive practices in various places. While I think that's possibly true in an EU regulatory sense and that side of it, one of the things they are being pulled up for is technically a breach of contract, where I was saying that that Amazon was using data that third-party vendors were selling on their platform and so on, and using it to bolster their own products. They said that they weren't doing that, and that all the third-party data was distinct. So a large part of that as well is breach of contract and data privacy and all that sort of stuff, as well as monopoly and competitive stuff. So just as a clarification to anyone who has just come from listening to the part one discussion of that.
Okay, thank you, James.
Cool.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yep.
So, artificial intelligence, what we'd call that, I suppose, the field of computer science that essentially creates and aims to replicate human thought processes. Would that be a fair?
I'm not sure that replicating human thought processes is a fair description. It's certainly a science fiction definition of it, but it's an aim to create a machine or a computer that is capable of learning and development. That it is a form of program that will change in response to certain types of inputs. Whether you want to describe that as a human brain or not, I really wouldn't, because a lot of the tasks that we're putting them to take humans longer,
Sure.
and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So the comparisons with human intelligence, I'm less keen on. We can get into talking about that with things like Gen AI and all that sort of stuff. And if we get talking about artificial general intelligence, then yes, we can start thinking about, is this something that has something approaching human consciousness? But that's only a very small segment of what AI is.
Okay. Fine. And I think given the kind of questions that I came up with in my head about AI, I should imagine, as I'm a sort of typical citizen who's not much of an expert in it, I should imagine other people will have similar questions too. So
Sure.
let's run through one or two inquiries that people might have about AI and see what we can learn from that. So one of the biggies, of course, which we often hear about, is about AI affecting jobs. Now, of course, obviously AI creates lots of jobs and it will create lots more in the future. But what do you think are the most exciting developments in AI right now, and how do you see those positively impacting our lives now and in the future?
It's the most interesting way I've seen to use AI is integrating it into essentially a feedback loop, that you kind of use AI as a sounding board to bounce ideas off. That it take ideas and it will iterate, and then it will spit them back at you, and then you kind of have a back and forth and so on with that. That's one of the kind of the big things about, oh, it's going to take jobs away. Some of the loudest voices in that particular field are artists and creatives of various sorts. And one of the interesting ways that I've seen seen AI talked about, I've not seen any real examples of this in the wild, but then again, looking into how the publishing industry and so on works isn't quite my thing. So this might be happening and I might be missing it. But one of the interesting things that you can do with it is say, ask it to give examples of a particular thing as part of, say, a drafting process, instead of, say, having an AI generate a final published image that an artist could have made. Having the AI generate drafts and kind of initial sketches almost, and to help a creative director think around the kind of art that they want to commission, rather than sketching ideas out themselves by hand and that sort of thing. So you can use, and in the same way with writing of pretty much any sort. And this is one way that I've used it in writing analytical reports for companies, is giving it a text and saying, how can this be improved, or can this be steered any particular direction, into something like ChatGPT, and it will come up with pointers in a similar way to the way that an editor or a proofreader could. And then you take that sort of under advisement, as it were, and say, well, does that make sense? Yes, no. Is it something I can tweak? It's an additional point of reference in your feedback loop of how you review things. That's sort of the closest thing to the sort of the public perceptions of AI. Within the probably the best application that I've seen for some of my clients and that sort of thing, or some of our clients, I should say, the way that they're using it is to look for patterns in network data, and use it to essentially, say, sift network traffic for anomalous patterns, and use that to hunt down cyber criminals or malicious content and traffic, and that sort of thing, in a way that a human functionally can't. And using those sorts of things as well as ways to optimize a network, make it more efficient, tweak certain settings, just purely on the back of, well, could this be done better from what the AI has already seen of network function? Probably in this particular way, yes, it could, and then giving it the ability to adjust those controls, or feeding it back to a human engineer saying, I've noticed that this could be improved. Do you want it done? Sort of thing. Just using it to look at things and interpret data and give it, and as part of a feedback loop, is probably the best general way of using it that I've seen. Using it as an assistant to various roles, that the amount of possibilities are quite staggering as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, ChatGPT is something I had an experience of it. I made a video of it maybe a year or so ago, and when it was just coming into the public domain, and I was like everybody fascinated by it. I did a few tests on it to ask it to produce things, and then I made a video, and I found it really interesting. And of course, I think now we know more about it, it maybe is a bit less astounding than when I first saw it in action. Because what I've done since then, in the first few months, I've tried to put it through its paces and test it. And obviously, it's an astounding piece of software, and it's a magnificent human achievement. But it is also obviously very defective at this stage. And of course,
Yes.
I'm sure they'll keep evolving it and producing tweaks that will eradicate these defects. But it's not something, you're very limited on what you can use it for in terms of its reliability, but it is an amazing thing. And I was wondering if people use this tool for things that humans used to use their own initiative for. Obviously, there are examples like creativity and maybe passing exams and things, which it's entirely inappropriate. But if people outsource their thinking onto an AI component like ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot or something, do you think there's anything fundamentally wrong with that if we can guarantee that it's accurate? So, for example, in business, if we wanted to produce something, maybe a feedback to a tender or something, AI could analyze all of the questions answered by the people submitting the bids, and it could produce all of the feedback that we want. is there anything, do you think, fundamentally wrong with our changing our behavior to do stuff like that?
Uh, Possibly, but I would say not much more than we already do with using search engines and the like,
Hmm.
because there's and I think we may have mentioned this in passing last time, but there have been studies shown that purely based on age, as in comparing, say, my generation, millennials, versus, I don't know whether it was done versus Gen X or baby boomers of that sort of age bracket. And I'm paraphrasing, so I can't give you precise bits, but
Hmm.
it was already noted that information retention amongst millennials and the information age generation was poorer, but we could find information more easily.
Yeah.
Um, and so that sort of process is already sort of happening to our brains as far as I'm concerned, because we're using search engines and so on. And anecdotally, I know several people just can't find their way back to places because they rely on satellite navigation and Google Maps and that sort of thing. It
Hmm.
somewhat atrophies your capacity for memory when you go to these places, when you use those tools. So using AI in those sorts of ways as a full-on substitute, I think, is quite dangerous, simply because you will start to lose some people will start to lose some capacity to do certain things, and in some ways institutions may, if they start to use it excessively. You'll start to sort of lose that overall knowledge base, if you like.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
I mean, Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, he thinks that he's tracked with help, I'm sure, he tracked a period of time, say I think he said 2012, when social media started to change with things like likes and different
yeah,
types of validation that people can seek meaning and seek authenticity from, and that he predicts that it's going to have and has already started to have a serious negative effect on young people's mental health. I,
yes.
I guess you've found similar things yourself, have you?
Yes, there's a lot of studies showing things, well, particularly things like increases in things like anxiety, depression, and those sorts of things amongst young people who use social media and those sorts of things is well documented. And
Mm.
I whether it, and then when it comes to things like attention span and so on, the things like likes and all that sort of thing, I think that's and I don't know whether it's more an awareness of the condition or whether it's actually happening, that we're also seeing increasing numbers of people of all ages, including adults, diagnosed with ADHD and the like. And that's because, and part of me thinks that's because these wonderful things are essentially feeding our brain far more dopamine than we have any rights to, and it's screwing with our ability to compute, because we're kind of swimming in this dopamine and desperate for more, and it's kind of
Mm.
spikes and crashes of dopamine, which are just interfering with our ability to function without it. It's that that social media is essentially becoming heroin for our brains in some way.
Yeah, and of course, also we're not being as social as we once were. We're not engaging with people face to
Yeah,
face in the same way, which is what we've evolved to do. So that's going to have a massive impact negatively on our well-being too, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. And I don't, and there has been some conversation about the use of AI sort of as a companion for folks, for older folk particularly, who are suffering from loneliness and so on. That's, I mean, that could work. It can be a reasonable facsimile of a conversation. Um, but whether it will actually help in the long term, I couldn't tell you. But I think it does have that danger of exacerbating some of the problems we're already seeing as a result of digital media.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we mentioned last time, you and I
Yeah.
are perhaps we're in a minority of people for whom a very interesting thing has happened in our lives, in that we grew up pre-internet in a
Mm.
time when we had all the spoils of growing up socially as children. We became adults. The internet was still in its infancy. When we got into our 20s and 30s, certainly for me that age, it then became prominent. So I've I've not grown up in a time when I've only known the internet, and I've not grown up in a time when I never got to experience it. So I think I'm grateful that I've seen both perspectives, and I'm glad that we have the technology we do. But it's certainly coming at tremendous cost, particularly for people I think who've only known that way of interfacing with the world. And as you say,
Yes.
particularly with the amount of information overload that they've got access, we've got access to everything pretty much that's ever been learned and written and videoed now. And I guess given our evolutionary legacy, we don't have brains that are optimized to cope with that kind of information overload, do
No,
we?
no, not at all. Which is a huge thing. And now what you're seeing is sort of premiums being placed on curation and the ability to sort through things and the ability to present certain things in certain ways, which is kind of a way of filtering out all of the torrent of information that is the internet. And that's one of the things that AI can do more or less, and that's how we are saying again. Just to go back, just to sort of touch on what we were talking about last time, algorithms,
Hmm.
similar in nature to how you think about AI, because they both learn, and so that they can adjust based on previous previous interactions, and so what's happened before will sort of it'll serve you up with more and more of the same in certain ways. And I sorry, I did have a point to connect it there, but I'm not sure quite where it's going. I lost that. But
Yeah, it's a curious one. I like it in some contexts. Like, for example, if I'm shopping on Amazon, if it knows I like books about the social sciences, I'm pleased that it recommends similar books. But I also try to have a very diverse browsing experience because I don't want it to be something that's just tailored to what it thinks my needs and my tastes are. Because I'm very interested, as you can probably tell, I'm very interested in the things that people believe that I disagree with, and I'm interested in the psychology of why they believe it. I think, as Kierkegaard said, you have to meet people where they're at, and you have to
mm,
really try to. If you don't understand where they're at and why or try to understand why they believe things, so I I'm concerned about younger people, particularly who perhaps don't have the same kind of will for discernment because they maybe don't know how much they're missing by just
mm-hmm.
getting fed the things that, and I'm sure, as we said before, these algorithms, they're very clever at getting you to click on what they want you to click on.
Yes.
And it's a big problem, isn't
Yeah,
it?
and various different ways of measuring engagement. And that was sort of, but using AI as sort of a curation tool has many of the same flaws, because that's essentially what the YouTube algorithms and so on will, and TikTok algorithms, all the rest of it, will function in a similar way, because depending on how the AI is trained, then they're going to say, well, what gets this person to watch more, then find more of it. And using AI as a curation engine, which is the way things are going to go, at least with certain types of media organizations, then it's going to wind up being more of the same, because it'll again prioritize engagement in whatever form that takes. And that's sort of what it means. It's knowing what the AI is trained on is another problem as well. It's what the goals of the AI are needs to be made clear, and what the training data for any AI needs to be made clear as well. There was some particularly some examples of this with some sets trained in the United States. There was instances where they wouldn't recognize a black person as a human because all of the training data it had been fed was with white people. So it's not got a wide basis on a diverse basis for understanding what a human is on that. And similarly, if you start feeding it information about criminals, then you're going to get different and then you're going to get different assumptions that the AI is going to make. It's going to replicate any biases that are in its data set, which is going to cause huge problems. That's already one thing that that's happened with things like job seeking. You were already talking about it in the sense of approving bids and contracts and those sorts of things. It's already being used to sift for jobs and candidates and those sorts of things. And so if someone has an unusual name that historically lots of people in the field haven't had, say a Hispanic name or something, just to keep with the US examples, then it's more likely to reject it purely on that basis. And so it's very, very tricky that you have to be able to train AI well. If you are asking an AI to exercise any form of judgment, which is sort of what any AI is going to do, then you need to know precisely what you're feeding it and whether it's sort of the entire universe of what it needs to know. And when it comes to generative AI and things like ChatGPT, then quite often it physically can't. That there is not enough ability for us to feed it enough data in ways that it can understand for it to fully assimilate what it needs to. Some of the better use cases are ones where the data set is limited. Say, if just to return back to the cybersecurity example, what it needs to know for baseline data is what is normal network function, so it can detect abnormalities and work out where they're coming from, stop them. You can feed it all of the information on the network in that case. You can give it the whole universe of everything it needs to know, and so it can do its job well. But when you can only give it partial information, which is based on human understanding in many ways, which is flawed, then it's going to just replicate those, and that's going to cause problems.
Yeah, and it from my experience early on of ChatGPT, it was found wanting on some of the basic tasks with arithmetic too. So I just basically I decided to stop using it, and I use it if I want to check for typos and things, because it's obviously much quicker than I am. But I tend to use what's it called, Grammarly now, which I'm finding quite useful. But
well, they're leveraging AI to some degree as well.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And this, I guess, we're moving on to the capacity for humans to reason, and the capacity to for AI to simulate the human ability to reason. As you say, in terms of an execution time for a task that would take humans months, perhaps it can do it very quickly. But there does seem to be a shortfall in the capacity to reason and think abstractly in the way that humans can. And I don't know whether that's just the limitations of the technology at the minute, or whether, in fact, probably it is the case that there's something about the human brain that is ultimately more sophisticated than what AI can produce at the level of abstract cognition. And I want to talk a bit about that, because
it's we don't really understand what inspiration is, I think, is the thing. We can't program inspiration because we don't really understand how it works in humans yet. Whether we or we can give theories about it, but it's not a process that we can comprehend, so we can't replicate it. That's, I think, fundamentally what the difference is.
Yeah. And the other thing I observed with ChatGPT in the early days was it seemed to me to have a clear ideological bias in terms of it seems to me quite clearly that the people that are behind the programming of ChatGPT have enabled it to reflect the values of themselves. Now, I want to talk about that because I suppose, correct me if I'm wrong, but technically ChatGPT is drawing from the whole body of online material, but it's
Mm.
definitely got a bias in terms of how it answers questions and how it expects or how it encourages you to think about questions. So how is that factored into the chat GPT? Is it just basically simulating the biases of the programmers?
Yes, and I'm not sure that I would say that it doesn't have the whole internet. There is no way that it has the whole internet. So we don't know what the full data set is that it's trained on. I
Right.
um I I can't remember whether OpenAI have publicized that anywhere. But it's probably listed somewhere. But it is that it is the case that it will reflect the biases of the data set. I think that's what it may boil down to. Um, if you're looking um, for certain types of information, I can foresee that they will have hard coded in some direct things like putting in responses to "Are you actually thinking?" No, I'm doing this, that, and the other, and explaining what a large language model is. And that would, I imagine, be something like a pre-programmed response. And if it's and if you start having someone talking saying, "I want to kill myself," then that's probably going to be flagged up and say, no, look, you shouldn't be talking to me about this. You should be talking to a trained
Mm.
professional,
Yeah, yeah.
and those sorts of things. So there are certain contexts where direct programmer intervention on the basis of the type of language used is probably warranted. Whether on the ideological side, I cannot say with any certainty, but if we go with historical generalities, shall we say, the majority of American media organizations, which is probably where it's pulling most of its English language content, is going to have a left of American center leaning. So that may explain any ideological feelings simply because of the pre-existing biases of the data set it's trained on.
Mm. Yeah. And I think society has a generalized left-leaning bias too. I remember Douglas Murray making this point that if you start at a kind of hypothetical center, which doesn't really exist, I don't think, in general terms, but he made the point quite well, I thought, that it, if you think of the extreme left and as being, I don't know, Stalinist Russia and the extreme right being Nazi Germany or something, then you can go a lot further left in gradual steps before you end up at the gulag. Whereas if you start going slightly to the right, you already open up for criticisms of, simulating Nazi and far right kind of thinking. So I think the left wing bias is existent in society as a whole, and I think there are good evolutionary reasons for that too. Um, so I wouldn't be at all surprised to see it in AI too. Um, let's talk about. I guess it's the distinction between what is real and what you might call fake in terms of being non-human, because I think this is really a really interesting element of AI. So um, as you know, if you ask ChatGPT to write um, a new Beatles song or a new Smith song, then it will it'll extrapolate from the information it has, and it will be able to create a song in the lyrics of Morrissey or Paul McCartney or something. Now, what I find curious about that is even if AI can attempt to do things as at least as sophisticated or even perhaps even sometimes more sophisticated than the human artist in question. And it's possible that we could talk about how that might happen. There's something about human creativity that makes you think it's just not the same if a computer does it.
Yeah.
Now, and I think we're still trying to sort of unpack, and you mentioned the keyword inspiration. It's, maybe you could ask an AI to write something simulating one of the greatest novels, and it might be astounding, and we might read it and think this is incredible, but it's not quite the same, is it? And
I've
what do
not
you
tried
make
to
of that?
I've not tried to read an AI novel, so I couldn't
No, me
comment.
neither. I've not even
But
tried to
yeah,
ask it to make
it's
one, but in theory.
yeah, I've seen AI generated art, and it's it and looking at those, the the various ways that in which they're framed is fairly consistent. You don't have completely different takes on perspective and those sorts of things that you could expect from a human artist trying to do certain things. They What you'll have is things that are very technically competent, but traditional, if I can put it that way, because they're drawing off existing bodies of content. They won't go outside of what you already know in some sense, in a way
Hmm.
that a human might. So there is that sort of feeling about it that doesn't quite work. And I know that there's also another uncanny valley, if you like, that exists with written content, that is down to different versions of English, if you like. If Because in some places the way that training data is fed into these things and flagged and marked is not is done in countries other than the UK and the US, and so they use but they're still potentially English speaking in some way. I can't remember precisely where I've heard this going on. That there I don't know whether it happens in India or other portions of English speaking Southeast Asia, but they will use English in different ways. They'll still speak
Hmm.
English, but when they're presented with an English document, they will tag and say this means this and this means that and this means the other on a different type of meaning to how a Brit or an American will understand it. And so content that is kind of spat back out at you from one of these generators having been tagged in that way is going to feel different because it's understanding English differently because of who's marked up the training data.
Sure. But even if we just stuck with, say, just take the UK context where, there's a large consensus between the British historically anyway on the English language in the last, say, 200 years. So let's say we don't have that to deal with. Let's say we just have straightforward interpretations of English language, and of course a writer who wants to write a book, say, next year, they will create something, but they will also be drawing on influence, even subconsciously, on their understanding of language, on the influence of other writers, on their
Yep.
experiences. So they produce a great work. And I think our response to it is obviously in a large part because it's a human being sharing their own thoughts and creativity and experience. Now, if an AI machine were to produce a novel which we read it and we thought, not only is this astounding, but it's actually, well, it probably wouldn't take us to groundbreaking levels by itself, would it? Because
No.
it wouldn't, but it might be astoundingly written. I guess there were two things. The first thing is it's still drawing so much from its own data source that
Yeah.
there might be a limitation on how good we actually think it is. But if it produced a work, say a work of great depth in psychological literature, which could easily be done, we wouldn't we wouldn't value it in the same way. But there
Mm.
seems to me to be a commercial limitation as well. Like if the future marketing potential is that AI is working alongside humans and producing works, and then somebody is reading them and saying, "Well, actually, I'm going to make this one saleable because it's a really deep piece of work." I'm not sure we would respond to it in the same way, and it takes a bit of unpacking to know fully why, if intrinsically the writing is that deep and that profound.
That's the thing. It's the if that I don't know whether we would necessarily respond that way unless we have the pre-existing context of it's that we know it's an AI piece. It's going to be difficult to say which way it's going to go until it happens almost, because I'm assuming there will be differences in the text with how it's presented. That's sort of my underlying assumption with this because of how the AI models work, and so I think I'm relying on the idea that seeing how an AI novel is produced it's discernibly an AI novel in some way,
Hmm.
because if it's not, then you'll react to it like you will any novel. um but but if you can't, but if you can tell it's an AI, there is going to be something in the structure in the language that's going to feel off. It's going to sort of hit that uncanny valley, in some ways.
Hmm.
That's going to be not quite how you're used to experiencing certain types of language or certain concepts or whatever. And so that's why that's why I'm thinking about it the way I am, because it's you've got to have that way of telling that it's AI in some way. Um,
Yeah, and I'm always amused in the morning when I open my BT Mail account. So I have a robot testing me to make sure that I'm not a robot. And I think, are we going to have to rely on AI to be able to discern, in some cases, of course, I mean, between what is AI and what is human generated? Is that
yeah,
something we're going to have to do?
very probably. um, I imagine that there are some corners of the internet where that's already a huge problem, where there's large amounts of free content available. Things like fan fiction corners of the internet, where you can just crawl it and pull and extract a huge amount of text and just produce things. And so getting to the point where you can tell where those things are different is going to be it's going to be a huge task, and that's the sort of task that an AI is going to be good at, going through text at astonishing speed and giving it a yes no answer or a probability at
Yeah,
the end of it
I mean,
all.
I was talking to somebody recently in Italy about the problem, the potential problem, which I want to talk to you about as well, about ju schoolwork and judging people's efforts
Yeah,
with AI. And she made an interesting point. This lady, she said the British have a very different attitude towards that than the Europeans, the Mediterranean particularly, and they have this the notion of an individual in a classroom, say in the UK, if you had a group of 20 pupils in a classroom, then you want them all to do their best and you want them to pass on their own merits. And of course, we look down on cheating. But their mentality that she was describing was interesting because she said actually they have this sort of mentality that if one person knows something, they can help the rest of them know it. And effectively, as long as they work together, it doesn't really matter how they achieve their pass, as long as they do. And I thought, well, that's completely anathema to. Well, firstly, I think that they are the victims themselves. I think if they do that, because you want to understand what you understand and you want to know where you are in the pecking order and things. So I guess I was going to ask you about this as well. So given that there are going to be lots of young people growing up with AI as part of the norm, how are they going to guard against people? And I'm going to ask this because I obviously the teacher's responsibility is to know the students and to try to discern what they know and whether they're cheating or not. But if it gets so commonplace, how are we going to distinguish between somebody who created something through AI and somebody who presented their own work if it's just to the discretion of the teacher who doesn't have time to submit everything through AI generators and stuff? So what do you
well,
make of that sort of
in a
problem then?
in a first thing in an exam context, you just make everyone write everything. um,
Sure.
that you just remove computers completely from the equation.
Yeah.
But if it's in a homework in a classroom situation, then yeah, it's going to be tricky because someone could quite easily just get the AI to generate it and write it out. The same test doesn't apply. So you can still do that sort of thing. Um, it's it's also depends on what sort of your method of schooling is, as well. It's basically that the systems that are more test based. So in some ways, the US is kind of more immune to it than others, because they do quite a lot in the way of tests. Whether they do good tests is another question, which we're not going to get into. But that anywhere where you've got sort of long drawn out assignment based things where people can go away and pull text, you're going to end up with the same version of the plagiarism problem, which will be harder to detect because it won't be direct plagiarism in quite the same way. So there will be sort of foibles of the engine that's being used and tendencies based on its data set. Like I say, there's you can tell that some AI engines will overuse certain words that are just a little different to commonplace English. And so you can look at it to some extent there. But you are going to have to some extent rely on AI to screen everything out. You already had, even in when I was at university, they were putting things through plagiarism screening programs. That what that was doing was just looking for chunks of replicated text. That there wasn't any notion of AI at that point that was readily available. So it's just going to be a more sophisticated version of that. It's going to serve the same function, but it will have to be AI based.
Yeah, and of course, it's worth noting as well that people who engage in that kind of behavior, they're ultimately only cheating themselves, aren't they? Because, you want to understand things and you want to put in the groundwork to be master of your subject. So there's very little gain, if any, to taking the shortcut. I mean, I think about this with spelling as well, because, and I don't know if there's any evidence to suggest that spelling has diminished because of the internet and even Microsoft products. But I know even for myself as a writer, I learned spelling from school, so I had again the best of both worlds. But I've allowed Word to autocorrect my typos for so long now that I wonder if young people brought up in that world have had a diminution of ability to spell.
Quite possibly. They'll be able to recognize correct spellings, I imagine, but I don't know if they were asked to spell things out, because they would still have the knowledge of what the correct stuff is from reading it. They won't have the kinesthetic knowledge of this is the word in the same way, but they will probably still have the knowledge somewhere. One of the more profound things that I've noticed from a friend, or have spoken to from a friend who's a teacher, is that he teaches secondary school classes, and none of them can read analog clocks. They have an analog clock in every classroom, and none of his pupils can read it.
They're joking.
No.
Wow.
Because they don't have to, because the time flashes up on the phone or on some digital thing.
Wow.
They'll get taught how to do it with the hands you can manipulate in primary school, but because they don't use it, they won't. They just forget. And so it's possible that things like autocorrect on spelling would do things like that, at least with your ability to produce the words as part of your general operation. Like if you're asking people to type without a spelling correction tool, yes, it's going to be an absolute mess, because they'll have built in to their muscle memory from keyboards and so on that these things exist and will correct it for them. So they will internalize the wrong spelling with their hands. But if you would ask them to handwrite it out, or ask them to spell it out in a spelling bee contest, that I think will stick more, because you still have to think about the structure of the word and see the layout of the word in a way which isn't being affected by spelling check tools.
So yeah, if people are falling victim to the use it or lose it problem, then
Yeah.
what else do you think might we lose by not using it in this digital age?
Um, I honestly couldn't say, because I'm not really in a position to notice what folk are or aren't using, and I'm not noticing a huge amount myself. It's difficult. It's very difficult to say. There will be some things that I will think, no, I will do this just because for the sake of doing it, but they're few and far between, and they're generally not tasks that can be delegated to computers and so on. But there will be some kind of outsourcing of the intelligence to computing, which we spoke about earlier. So it'll just be an extension of that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I've been thinking about quite a bit, um, and it's a difficult one to measure, but whether this whether this latest generation and perhaps generations to follow, I don't know. I'm still trying to work it all out, but whether there's any significant detrimental effect on their ability to reason and critically evaluate. Now, I mean, obviously, IQ is heritable and it's measurable, and we know a lot about the history of IQ. But in
Well, we know
terms
about
of
IQ tests.
what we
I'm
yeah
I'm
what
very
we
skeptical that IQ tests are measuring anything other than the ability to pass IQ tests, but that's just me.
well they're measuring fluid intelligence at a level that gives you indications of the abilities of the participants. Although, of course, applying it is much more complex than that.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things we know is that if people repeatedly take it in different types, they tend to get roughly the same scores. But in terms of the sort of triad of critical evaluation, interpreting information, and raw reasoning skills, I it seems to me, given the number of people that believe so many absurd things, that we have a bit of a crisis in thinking. But it also is possible there are other causal factors that are
Oh
just
yeah.
making it appear that way. So, I mean, we talked about how people are led by algorithms, how they end up in echo chambers, how they outsource some of their thinking onto other types of platforms, and possibly as well, even, or well, in fact, almost certainly as well, even other um, influential figures. We're globally connected. We have access to all of this information. People are very likely being led and having work done for them and outsourcing their thinking in ways that they wouldn't have been doing in the same way 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, probably.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are lots of benefits now that they wouldn't have had 50, 60, 70 years ago too, of course. But
Mm.
how help me unpack that. Is it creating a generation or two that are just not as critically astute as people of the past, you think?
I think it's a combination of things. It's that creation of echo chambers. It's the tendency towards passive absorption of content, which has been going on for as long as TV's been a thing. Um, and just the ability to shut out other voices and so on. And not ha- and so and yeah, as you say, there are just so many contributing factors. I don't think that it's something we can lay at the door of AI that it's going to make this worse. I think it will to some degree, but it won't do so in isolation because it's already far enough down the path of of having information and opinions and evaluations just all served to you that you can absorb and regurgitate back. That's already happening. So I don't think that AI is going to make that worse on its own.
No, and I think the other thing to mention perhaps at that stage is that we know from studies in psychology and neuroscience that, and to some extent some old philosophers too, like David Hume, is that you know the intuition and the emotional attachment to things is way more influential than the reasoning part, which
Yes.
seems to come after, and people they're being tilted in a certain direction intuitively and of course tribally and all sorts of
Hmm.
other reasons, and then they retroactively impute some reasoning to the thing that they already want to believe, and that's why it's so that's why it's so difficult. Was it Jonathan Swift? I think you said you can't. It's almost impossible to reason someone out of something that they haven't reasoned themselves into in the first place. So
Yep.
that must also be a big factor in this problem that we're seeing. If you're already primed to seek out the things you want to believe, especially politically and sociologically, perhaps, then that's going to be a problem that's exacerbated by all this having all this stuff to hand, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it can if it's programmed to be a tool to expand that and seek out alternative perspectives,
Mm.
and other other things. It can be used to broaden, but I imagine that not going to be many that will be wanting to use it explicitly for that. That's you've already need the ability to, or the inclination to want to seek out something that's different, which is not something that we're really programmed to do in quite the same way.
Yeah, sure. Tell me about the ethical and perhaps even potentially societal dangers of things like um, deep fake, because I think we're still in the infancy of deep fake, but I notice
Unfortunately.
even just from my online browsing experiences that sometimes I'll see something that looks really interesting, and over time you start to get a sense of what's fake and what's not. And then you see the comments, and people will be, "Oh, that's amazing," and "Wow, fantastic," and then someone will say, "Ah, no, it's AI, it's fake," and then you start to sort of discern. And this is in the very, as I say, early stages of that. But we've read about the dangers of this stuff getting in the wrong hands, and people can effectively create videos, and they've done it with politicians, haven't they, where and they've
Yeah.
simulated the voice, so you don't know initially whether it's fake or not. Now at the moment I think it seems to me that those things are still in the minority enough that we can probably have a reasonable browsing experience and not fall foul to it too much. But is there a danger, or how likely is the danger, would you say, that manipulation of that kind could get so far advanced that we end up in a situation where it's almost impossible to tell in some areas what's real and what's not anymore?
Yeah, I think that's very, very likely, um, particularly given particularly given things like wanting to particularly given um, third states, shall we say, or second states wanting to interfere in elections, those sorts of things. I think that's very, very likely that we are going to approach the point where it's going to be difficult to tell. Because if there is something compromising that shows up, does the person who's portrayed want to own up to it? No, they won't. And so they'll say, "Oh no, that's not me." And so you can say, are they telling the truth or not? You need to there's going to be no real basis for telling what the truth is if the images are not distinguishable from, and the recordings and so on are not distinguishable from things that we know to be true. Then it's going to be really, really difficult to tease out things, particularly where someone has a vested interest in saying that something is or is not the case. This and so having some means to verify it by a third party has been going on for a while now. Folks like Snopes and other fact finders have been trying to clarify various claims made, um, and so on. Those sorts of organizations are going to be utterly swamped, and whether they can actually discern the truth or not, what they're going to have to be doing is sort of basing it off official briefings that they can verify the provenance of and those sorts of things. But that's going to be limited in itself. So all they can really report is where their sources are saying, "I'll say you saying, oh, there's this footage of someone in bed with 3 men and a dog or something, that was designed to stir outrage, and so they can check, oh, this public statement has been issued denying that this is real, from XYZ office. From them, from their movements, we know that he was in fact somewhere else. That's possibly a tell, but anything other than that, can we really know? Because of course they're going to deny that sort of thing. So it's and then organizations that are dedicated to kind of sifting what it is, they're going to have to shift their basis for what their understanding of it is. It's going to say, well, we know this because of we know this because of X, Y, and Z, and so how those organizations work is going to change, and whether they can still be trusted to, or whether folks will still trust them afterwards, because in some senses, seeing is believing. It's kind of, this video looks real, wow. Then but they're saying, oh, that's not true, but it looks really convincing. And you'll get similar things to the way that people have thought about, say, the Loch Ness Monster and UFOs and that sort of thing, but on a far larger scale, in higher definition.
Yeah, well, it could also be the case that if the deep fake pollution of the online communities, if it becomes so sophisticated and so prominent, that it may even be able to offer deep fake simulations of the things that are claiming to arbitrate between deep fake and reality too. So it can put the problem one step back. And I suppose the other thing is that even if there are plenty of sophisticated tools in place to distinguish, I guess the other problem is, of course, going back to the human bias, is that not everyone's going to pick up on that. No. And actually, let's say there was a video of, I don't know, Donald Trump saying something outrageous, which isn't that difficult to find even in real life. But let's say there's something really damaging for a Donald Trump type figure. You get the feeling that there'll be enough people that would want to believe that anyway, that they would have their opinions altered or justified just by the existence. But given that unless something radically changes, we're going to need, as humans, we're going to need a consistent and safe online experience. I'm guessing we're not going to be able to invigilate the deep fake problem bottom up. So we're going to have something top down that ensures that it goes through the necessary filters to ensure that our browsing experience is as valid as it can be.
Exactly what that's going to be, though, and what that will mean for different jurisdictions and so on, because the instant you start talking about regulation, everyone gets twitchy, and big tech has historically been horrible at regulating itself and adhering to codes of conduct and things like that, codes of practice. It doesn't, again, going back to algorithmic stuff, measuring engagement is what they want, and they want you to remain within their ecosystems and so on. That's not predicated on truth. That's predicated on comments, outrage, and things like that, or just playing cat pictures, just whatever, kind of, you're sitting zombified watching a thing. You don't care if it's true or not. It's just cute. And so the companies that are having you on their platforms don't really care about the truth in the same way.
No.
You can see, you can potentially see government bodies wanting to regulate this and having some sort of standard in place for it, and to some extent that's already there. But it's or some sort of practices are already there because certain things are against are against the law, like presentation of sexual content involving minors, for example. That's against the law in most countries. I imagine there's some where it's not, but um, and so having so the regulators having the tools to say you can't do this, it's wrong, is what, and that's going to vary country by country, even assuming that any such framework is workable.
Yeah, well,
So
I mean,
it's going to be a mess.
I'm probably one of the least friendly people you'll ever meet regarding regulation and
Yes.
over-regulation. I But where it's beneficial, I'm obviously going to be hugely in favor of it. And I think if there was some, I'm very in favor of regulation that stops children accessing online porn. I don't know how successful it's been, but it seems to me that's one of the most damaging things. Because I think I read somewhere that the you know the majority of porn, that's not to say the vast majority, but the majority of porn online is accessed by people like 11, 12, 13, 14, which is awful. And um if there was some regulation that could actually genuinely put paid to a deep fake that was in a way that's pernicious, I wouldn't be too against that, because I think almost like in a sort of tragedy of the common sense, I think we have to be careful what we allow in as human beings, because
Yes.
actually, if there was something powerful enough and influential enough to undermine our ability to ingest information digitally, then everybody loses out. And in fact,
Yeah.
the people polluting that environment, in effect, might probably would create something that they would ultimately would come back to bite them too, because they have to be
Maybe
careful what they destroy. But
it
but
does. Yeah. Mm.
go on, no, go on.
No, I was gonna say it strikes me as something that I've read recently about just general dictatorships, totalitarianism, and so on. One of the big tools there for stirring up hatreds and so on is essentially it's a gish gallop, if you know what I mean by that.
Yes.
It's just it doesn't matter that it needs to be that the thing that you're saying is true or right or even consistent or whatever. You just spew out continual narratives, and eventually it will sink in. And so there's that sense of, so long as a particular actor can produce a certain level of content and to cause enough doubt and questioning about what's real, what's not, what's true, what's not, then you start to create environments where simple answers are generally the best. And that leads to things like demagoguery. I mean, and all of those consequences. It's easy to turn that around. Is this when you create that epistemic uncertainty about everything? Then you used to say, well, this I don't know about this, I don't know about that, I don't know about the other, but I do know that I like what they say. And it's a nice
Yeah.
simple answer, and it can generate a following. You can see that in I mean, I think that sort of thing already exists to some degree online, not in any pernicious sense, just that folks like to follow particular people because they like the messaging, and that they're not really sure of a whole heap of things, but it just aligns with what they already like. And I think that if and deepfakes means that the truth is questioned enough to the point where that's generalizable, that's going to be in the end results. You're going to get simple narratives pushed by someone who can generate a decent following, and just to steer their narrative, because what's true and what's not no longer matters. It just matters whether someone likes it.
Yeah, I think that's a massive problem. I think we've been living through that for some time now, where
Yeah.
the 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 notion of what's true, so valuable as it is to people who will seek the truth, because as far as I'm concerned, there's no better way to live than to seek the truth
Mm.
wherever that leads you, because, well, for all sorts of obvious reasons, it's there's why would you live any other way? But yeah, I think that's the thing. It's when when you live in a society where actually the narrative has changed so much that even what is true isn't as important anymore,
Yep.
then you have various pockets where that isn't even being fought for, and then of course all sorts of other things are let in. And
Yeah.
one thing I really think is damaging, and I've seen this with Facebook and YouTube in recent months too, more so and more so. And I don't I want to talk a bit about that because it's basically that, and they are private platforms, I suppose, so they have the right to do this, I guess, as a libertarian sort of, someone who's friendly to libertarianism. It's like, if you own a house or you get to choose who your dinner party guests are, and if you don't want someone there, you don't have to invite them again. So they are private platforms, and we're getting a lot of free benefits from them, like say YouTube and Facebook, to be fair. But I've noticed in the last few months and possibly a year or two more than ever that things are being cancelled or being taken down on these platforms when, in my estimation, they are just discussions by two individuals or more who are having an open dialogue about things that some people may find extreme, but they're certainly not doing anything threatening. They're not telling lies in terms of distorting facts. As in, they're not making false claims about
Mm.
something that they could be sued for. They may have interesting and extreme opinions, but they've been taken down or the comments have been turned off. And I think this is not just worrying, but it's absolutely fundamentally detrimental to the qualities and the benefits of free inquiry, free expression, and the ability. It's almost like they're saying, we don't want you to even listen to this person because we decided that they're wrong, and we'll shut them down from our platform. And I just think that is a thin end of the wedge that's going to become so much more damaging if it continues.
Yeah, it's it depends on, yeah, it depends on what those terms are, terms of service are, and so on. And it's, yeah, it harms, it narrows the windows of what discussion is, which it depends on whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. There's conversations about the Overton window and all that sort of stuff. Um, but but yeah, it feels to me that things that AI is, it's not going to, it's going to help make that sort of thing easier. I think with all of the things we've discussed, AI isn't the cause, it's that AI can
Yeah.
function as an accelerant very, very easily.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting AI is the cause of that. I'm suggesting it's the
Yeah.
people behind the scenes. But
Yeah.
I it is a difficult one because I remember having a conversation with Keith Morris, who runs Network Norfolk, and I said to him a few years ago that although, of course, I'm very pro free speech, as it's a church website, I didn't think he ought to allow a columnist to come on and write about pro young Earth creationism. And I said that because I don't think the encouragement of spreading misinformation like that is helpful, even though I respect people's right to put it on their own blogs and agree with it. So I guess it's kind of an analogy to the dinner party, or maybe even the
Mm.
university. There might be people that universities don't want to have a platform to come and speak, not because they're against free speech necessarily, but because they just don't want that person coming on board. But I think something like YouTube or Facebook, where the platform is you get to put you get to share your YouTube videos, you get to make them as you see fit, and as long as you're not doing any of the things I mentioned earlier, which I think are exceptions to free speech, like slandering, like threatening, and all that sort of stuff. I just am very concerned that this sort of thing is being censored in the way that it is, and I don't know. I get the feeling that the vast majority of people in society don't want that kind of level of sensitive. And this is where I find it interesting, because I also think that about the woke culture too. I think this whole getting offended on people's behalf and feeling like you're nervous about being able to express your opinions. I was talking to a university lecturer the other day who said, we've got to the stage now where our people attending lectures are quite nervous about giving their opinion on quite a few subjects. And we've got into this culture where it's become normalized. And I don't think most people want that to be the case. And yet, influential platforms are, to my mind, imposing it on us. And I doubt it's there by common consent.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to judge. I'm not going to touch the woke stuff with a barge pole. I'm not qualified either way. But it's question of yeah, again, the question of do they do they have the right to, or what extent are these things now public services in some way? I know that Twitter has certainly talked about being sort of a digital town hall or a digital town square, something like that. They've made those sorts of analogies, but at the end of the day, they're run as a company, and so, but if they're wanting to project those images, there is that sort of disconnect between what they're saying they want to do and the things that they say they are doing, or the things that they are doing. But it's a very difficult line. It's a very difficult line to draw. It's not something that I feel I can say should or shouldn't
No,
happen either way, because there's cases to be made. There's cases to be made on lots of sides, and the way that I would extend it is that, just as a general principle, that if you are questioning, well, as a sort of a universal principle, if you are questioning or implying to question the fundamental humanity of anyone, then no, that's where I would draw anything of a line, which to some extent kind of, I mean, and that can in itself go to a whole bunch of different places, because you then start to then you look at, say, the U.S. Constitution, where slaves are explicitly 3/5 of a person in terms of voting count, and those sorts of other dehumanizing things. So it's, even that line gets very, very fuzzy very, very quickly, and
sure. Okay.
it's very, very easy to sort of take offense at whatever's being taken down, whatever stripe you are, because you think that it should be allowed for discussion. It's not something that I feel qualified to say
Yeah,
much of.
it is difficult, I think, yeah, as my network Norfolk point illustrates. I was going to mention something when we are talking about the differences in how children and young people engage with the world now. And one thing I was going to mention, which somebody a few months ago said to me, yeah, they said, when I was a lad, I used to be on BMXs and skateboards and things, and I wasn't stuck in a screen, and nothing bad happened to us and all that. They were really, nostalgic for a life where children were out playing, and I made a comment as a kind of a joke, but I sort of played devil's advocate and said, well, I was doing that too, but was I doing that because we didn't have access to the entire world's information? And I meant it in a sort of jocular sense, but it did get me thinking that in the trade-off between what we used to do as kids, playing ninjas and soldiers and skateboards and stuff, and because we didn't have almost any of the sophisticated technology that we do have now. Social problems aside, because I think there is a massive problem that we're not socializing young people in the same way that they need to be. But that aside, accepting that is a problem, what do you think of the sort of trade-off between how we used to be and how we are in terms of what we have now at our fingertips? And is it quite a natural human progression, I think, to want to spend more time on screens because we're just exhilarated by how connected the world is and how much information there is?
I think that comes down to what you think a human is in some sense, or what the natural context for a human is, because the ability to find anyone means that you can or find anyone, find any topic. You can have whatever group you want online based around shared interests, shared beliefs. Right or wrong about any of those, is that the natural way we functioned? Historically, that's not the way we've been at all. We've had to cope and exist with the people who are in our physical locality. The whole thing of it takes a village to raise a child, and those sorts of things. But this idea of the enablement of remote connection to other things based on who we are, it allows an elevation of and the sense of self, an ability to redefine and refine and develop and elevate the idea of what you are as yourself, your personhood, because you can find things that start to chime with how you think and develop that, give you the cognitive tools if you look for them to develop that further, or like-minded people to express similar opinions and to bring you into those sorts of mindsets. Now that's very, very easy to do, whereas the things that will shape you when you don't have those are the folk around you, and so you will sort of get much more of an aggregate of your locality, and those sorts of things. So just to give a fairly benign example, if you're the only person in your village who likes comic books and you can't get hold of many comic books and can't talk about comic books, you don't develop all of the habits of comic book culture, if you like.
Yeah.
The ability to kind of form interest-based cultures is very, very limited if you can't get, or it's comparatively limited, I should say, if you can't get online and can't travel to find like-minded folk. And so the way that you try and interact and coexist is quite different, and the internet encourages you to think of, I can develop my own interests and myself and find interest-based communities, and I don't need to pay attention to anything else. Whereas the communities that function when you don't have that are more location-based, centered around more common interests, whether that's say how well the crops have done this year, or how the steel mill is, or whatever. They're a lot more sort of grounded, and as far as I'm personally concerned, less interesting to me as a person, but that's because I've grown up with a lot more in the way of abstract interests and so on, which I find it very, very hard to find people unless I go to those communities online that have them. And so that's what I think. So if you think people can function as sort of individual units and have the right to develop themselves in whatever way, then yes, digital communities are fabulous and they're wonderful because they give you the best possible means to do that. But whereas if you think of humans as social things, then it makes it then the picture's a lot more mixed, because you get to choose your society in some ways, and you still have the residual of a society you don't choose in the physical, and so that kind of becomes an inconvenient little appendix that doesn't really seem to function right, but you still need to function with, despite the fact that that's not your preferred method of interacting, and so you don't really develop the skills to exist in meat space.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely. I think I totally agree with that. Yeah, that's a really good answer. I've got a couple of things more that I wanted to discuss.
Sure.
One is, we've all seen and read science fiction where there's a real sense of foreboding about future
Yep.
AI. And I remember having this discussion years ago, and I think I wrote an article about it as well, about the potential dangers of AI getting beyond our control. Now, obviously, that's a lot to unpack, and we'll perhaps do it quite quickly. But I I made a point then, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that as well, is that although potentially machines and AI can do things in greater scope than humans can do in terms of damage as well as good things, they're only going to be as, whatever the adjective is, as humans are. So somebody made a point about evil AI once, and I said that in terms of a kind of ethical judgment, AI can't be any more sinister than the people programming it, although it can do a lot more damage potentially in scope. Now, my question is, in terms of a future where AI is even way more sophisticated than it is now, do you see any potential dangers, widespread, even global dangers, that AI could get beyond our control and radically undermine or change human stability as we know it?
I mean, it's depending on what it's connected to. is my ultimate answer there. If you just have ChatGPT that will just talk and give prompts and all of that sort of thing, then it's no real problem. You can just ignore it and do things as you will if it's not hooked up to any other systems. The instant we start to have AI making direct decisions about the status of computer networks, then you start to have the possibility of harm, because they can then decide to direct resources away from something that from a portion of the network that is potentially supporting a vital function in some way, whether that's intentional or not, on the part of the AI. That will depend on programming and whether you it sort of comes unintended consequences, and sort of the idea. It's not sort of the accidental versions of you need to be killed to save you from yourself sort of idea that we see in some sci-fi. That sort of thing is that if you've got an AI that's managing a habitation for X number of humans, it becomes easier and more efficient to manage if there are less humans in there. And that, I think, is a fairly logical thing from say a resource perspective, that could be an unintended consequence of an AI system programmed to optimize how it works. It notices every time someone dies, it becomes easier to optimize. So it will think, oh, I just need to get more people to die, then it becomes easier to optimize everything. Those sorts of unintended consequences are going to be sort of the near-term problem. I don't think you're going to want something that will absolutely want to wipe us out because there is an intention or a preference behind it.
Yeah, that's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's unintended. It seems unlikely that AI would be intending to do something like that. As you say, it's beholden to the program. Although, of course, I guess there are real dangers, and maybe even now, but certainly in the future, where if a tyrannical human had the power to use artificial intelligence, they could quite easily, shut down the banking system, or they could shut down the internet for certain countries, or they could, stop some countries having gas. I mean,
well,
that is a real problem, isn't it?
It's sort of the Daleks problem, if you like. That the idea that Davros programmed the Daleks to dislike everything apart from the Daleks, just entirely forgetting that the Kaleds were not Daleks, and so the Daleks wiped out their creators. So it all depends on how it's programmed and what it's hooked up to. But yeah, you've got to sort of see what the intent is behind these engines, and how that's implemented to some degree.
Yeah.
So it can do things outside of the scope of its programming. It also depends on how far AI is allowed to iterate on itself. If
Yes,
if
yes,
it's if it's given if you program it to the point where it will be trained on data that will then feed back, and then you have AI training AI, which incidentally already happens. There are what's called adversarial AIs that will bounce things back and forth to for things like cybersecurity is another is another example where this is becoming reasonably common, where you can drill an AI on simulated attacks and defenses and so on for cybersecurity purposes. When
mm,
you get to that, generally it starts to get interesting, because you can't really foresee what the ultimate result of all that self-referential feedback is,
yeah,
and that's where it starts to cause problems. And I think generally speaking, we've got to the point where or we've got enough sense at the moment to think that's where it should stop. For example, there was one of the Facebook AI chatbots that they tried to create. They set two talking to each other, and essentially they turned it off when they started to not use human language, because they developed statement response, statement response, statement response in something that wasn't human language. Whether they
okay.
were starting to communicate in some way that we couldn't see, or whether it was just procedural stuff, we don't really know. But that's sort of the beginnings of that sort of independence, um, where you can see potentially where the AI becomes self-governing. I think is the ultimate principle there. If if the AI gets to a point where it can affect its own development, then the ability to do something that is harmful to humans, whether intentionally or not, insofar as intent is possible with AI, whether it does it intentionally or not is not really the question. It's just, can
Mm,
it do something harmful, and the ability to do that becomes much more likely if it becomes self-governing.
yeah, okay, yeah, makes sense. Last question, I was gonna finish on this. I wanted to ask you if somebody from the early 20th century were transported into 2024, say, they would obviously be astounded at the technological advancements that we've made, and they would, you know, as per sort of Arthur C. Clarke's third law, they some of the stuff would be indistinguishable from magic. They wouldn't really
Yep.
be able to compute in their heads. My final question to you is, if we time traveled 50, 60 years ahead from now, maybe even 100, whatever you think is a good time frame. It, hard question, I know, very speculative, but what do you expect that we might see that would astound us?
I'm just gonna go for a big thing here. I don't know what time frame, whether it will be 50 or 100 years, but the pace of technological advancement does seem to be increasing to some degree. I mean, it tends to be settling on standard form factors and iterating rather than totally revolutionizing. But assuming that's still possible, it's accelerating to some degree. Um, I think that the biggest shifts that we've seen in human civilization is changes in the ability to communicate information. So, things like moving from stone tablets to paper, and from there moving from handwritten stuff to the printing press, and then printing press to compute to moving to the digital, and the way that that's accelerated everything. Those have been the biggest and most influential shifts as far as I'm concerned. I think that we've got enough sort of tools now, that the next sort of shift in how we process information is going to possibly be within that sort of 50 to 60-year time frame. I don't know what it's going to look like. I mean, it might even be down to sort of that very, very hopeful Back to the Future 2, where they kind of, you have to use your hands? That's like a baby's toy kind of idea, that the idea that we will have some form of direct processing of information that that the information we receive is more related to our neurology than it is now. It would certainly, or maybe actually no, maybe Back to the Future is not a better one. That whole idea of the Matrix, I know kung fu, kind of programming in an understanding or programming in an experience, something like that. Just some more direct ability to assimilate and process information, which will potentially increase our ability to understand and go back to that whole thing of filtering it, or do a better job of recontextualizing information, or making the amount of information that we have, which will only continue to grow, much more easy to process. That's sort of the next big technological leap that we're just not going to be able to comprehend, because it's going to change us, or change how we interact with the world around us so fundamentally that that it's just not going to be something the way that we can really understand it, so to speak.
Yeah, and do you think alongside that there'll be a radical change in how we work? Because if you look back 100 years or so, the working week was so much longer because of all the other things we had to do that we've now outsourced to, machines. And the I think I read a while back the average working week now is like 37 hours, and it obviously was 50, 60, 70 years ago. And will our technological enhancements, will they give us even more leisure? Will it radically change the amount of work we have to do, particularly if we can outsource a lot of things onto AI further? Or will it just be that there are so many more jobs created that we didn't even know were jobs that will keep us busy? What do you think about that?
I think that kind of Keynesian optimism about the future of work is misplaced, because jobs are predicated on the idea that humans have value, and that human labor somehow has value. I don't think that will I don't think that will necessarily diminish, because and because of market forces ultimately. Because if it's the idea of, well, you don't have to work, you can sort of sit back and you'll get your universal basic income or whatever, and that you'll get a given amount of work, or even you only need to work, say, 2 days a week to get what was previously a week's worth done, then there will always be someone who's willing to work for 3 if it means more money. So so the value of human labor, regardless of technology, doesn't change, and the amount of time that we can pump into whatever that labor is not going to change. And so
Yeah,
I
I
think
agree. Yeah,
that fundamental truth about the labor market is what's going to govern that.
yeah. I mean, I agree with that. And of course, status is another factor where people, as you
Yeah.
say, are always going to want to, be out competing other people, and that will keep people working. But it is also true that we have diminished our working week in terms of what's necessary, and even things like, I think I wrote a blog about this a while. All of the things that we'd look back on and see how much work they took compared to now. Even things like making a Sunday roast or something, or um,
Yeah.
traveling, whatever it might be. There's bound to be a time when all these things are streamlined further. But yeah, I think that there will be an arms race between the need to work and the desire to not work as much. But I think I read somewhere in
Yeah.
Google, didn't it? That didn't Google offer people as much holiday as they wanted to take, and ended up taking fewer days than when they were
Yeah.
allocated?
That tends to be the findings when you give people as much holiday as they want, provided they get the work done. They tend to take less, because there's not a
Mm.
sense of, oh, I've got to have a certain amount. It's just a case of, oh, I'll take what I need, and it starts to kind of cut back a little bit, and then and then your workload will get adjusted to the time you're taking off, and so on, and it becomes not exactly symbiotic isn't quite the word, but it becomes a feedback loop, that
Mm.
you take less holiday because you think you need to get the work done, but then you get given enough work concomitant with the amount of holiday you're taking, and so on and so on.
Yeah,
So
I thought it
yeah,
was a fascinating finding. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. James, I've really enjoyed it. Final comment, anything else you wanted to add or say?
Just more thoughts about, well, just there are other bits of AI to talk about. That what some of the things we haven't touched on is the amount of computing power that those things take, which is immense, and the amount of energy you need to pump into those things. That the AI industry is already sort of the electrical consumption of small countries. I don't know precise figures.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
But it means that that's sort of a limiting factor to some degree, and particularly as companies get more concerned about environmental issues as well and want to start reducing the amount of energy they consume, that's going to be a concern in the not too distant future as well, as to whether that will be limiting what it does. But as the AI models get more complex, they start to consume more electricity and so on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
That's something else. And also, at some point, we've sort of touched on this, but not to any great degree, but sort of the base level of allowing putting data in a format that AI can use it is generally done by a person somewhere. And so like the tagging of documents to say this is a verb, this is an adjective or whatever, to help an AI to understand how it all works. It fundamentally is grounded still in human labor, and there's questions there. And again, like with the whole idea about AI art, the idea of that labor then becomes infinitely scalable. If you then say, well, this person has taught this AI what this book means, and that then gets applied thousands of times over, is there any kind of fair compensation you can give that person if that then feeds into whatever else? It comes into a question of, well, I don't know whether that kind of person deserves royalties, whether that's sort of the implication of saying that you can't compensate them fairly for it, or residuals or something like that. So AI is a tool for scaling things, but it can't really do anything on its own. There's that interaction between the human inputs and the outputs. I think that's driving part of the concern about the artwork, that corporations are essentially taking things without asking and kind of making profit off the back of images they can of reimaginings of images they can get their hands on, and those sorts of things. So it's a question of, do they should the original source code source things that the AI model is based on, should they get compensated for that? There are all sorts of questions about how the foundation of the AI models are working that we're sort of starting to grapple with. There was a fantastic quote from Microsoft's head of AI, which I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember the exact thing, but he was essentially saying that I thought it was sort of an open understanding that if there's anything on the open web, it's up for grabs. At which point everyone immediately said, Microsoft says it's okay to pirate their software, everyone. Which is the logical consequence of that. If you can find a copy of Microsoft Word on the open web, you can use it. So there's all sorts of kind of things about what can and can't, or should and should not go into these sorts of models, and what that means for the origin point of the AI, whatever that is, whether that's the human textual understanding or whether that's the artist, that are still fundamentally being grappled with, and whether there's any way of making that into a reasonable economic model ultimately is one of the bigger questions.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's a very good point as well about energy consumption. And we had Moore's law, and the computational power doubles every 18 months, and if it is exponentially increasing, that it might flatten out with things, as you say, like energy consumption. And
there is a corollary to Moore's law. I think they call it Dennard scaling, which is the ability to power the number of transistors. Moore's law is the number of transistors doubles every 6 months, which in theory is doubling of computational power. The ability to deliver electricity to those transistors is another thing. That's called Dennard scaling, and that has flattened off. You'll see a trend called dark silicon. So there's portions of a chip that can't be used in certain ways, even if it's there, and so it gets very, very tricky to work out how chips should be powered. I think that's part of the reason why multiple cores developed. I don't know for sure, but it wouldn't
Yeah,
surprise me if that is to try and break it off into units that can individually be powered. And so there are those sorts of technical limits to how the electricity works and so on. And basically, AI will just carry on just building more and more warehouses full of discrete graphics cards to power these things, or not graphics cards, but more specialized chips now. It started as graphics cards, but it's those sorts of things, and that's just going to go as far as the economics will allow.
yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. James, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed that. I found it so interesting, and I hope people watching and listening do too. So, yeah, thank you for being my guest for part two, James. I
Not a
really,
problem, James. It's been a
re
pleasure.
really appreciate it, and thank you for tuning in. I'll put the link to the previous show in the description and a link to the blog. So please follow on there and do like and subscribe. And thank you for tuning in. Good night.
Bye.